This is Aaron Levine, LG Insurance, with another episode of And Insurance. And today we are with Joe Asterita from Bonfiglio and Asterita law firm, attorneys at law. The law offices of Bonfiglio and Asterita, I think is what it is, out of Staten Island and Red Bank. How are you, Joe?
Great. Thanks for having me, Aaron.
Glad to have you. We have a lot of good conversations, some great topics to discuss today. We got a lot of questions when people are renting new spaces. So I'm glad you could join us so we can really dive in a little bit, get a little bit deeper into how business owners should interact with their lawyers and their landlords when they're getting into new real estate space. So give me a little introduction about who you are and a little bit about your law firm.
Sure. I've been practicing a little over 21 years. I practice both in New Jersey and New York, as you mentioned. Our offices are in Red Bank out of New Jersey, and in Staten Island and New York. We cover both states, top to bottom. A few attorneys in the firm. We focus mainly on real estate-related matters, including leasing, commercial leases, purchases, sales, commercial space, business matters from top to bottom, small to large. Represent clients of all kinds, everything from hair salons up to multimedia, type corporations and everything in between.
So a lot of residential real estate as well, I know.
Sure.
That market is kind of wild.
Yeah.
Is it taking you away from some of the business stuff, or in the current environment, it's kind of balanced itself out?
Well, I think given the last year, it's definitely kept us busy, with the way the market is. But as things are loosening up now, I'm seeing a lot more people returning to the business space. So that part of our practice is continuing to thrive.
Right. So we're excited, from an insurance standpoint. We're hopeful that a lot of people are starting new businesses. We're hopeful that people are going to fill up those empty retail spaces. And when somebody starts a business, they get a lease. Sometimes it's 10 pages and it's handwritten, or it's from 1986 because you have an old timer that's used the same lease forever and hasn't changed. And that's okay. We like that too, I guess. And sometimes we get a lease that's 90 pages long, right? The bigger the landlord, the bigger the lease. I mean, as many buildings as they have, they add a page for every time they acquire a new property. And they also ask for more and more insurance as they continue to grow themselves. When should a business owner or prospective business owner consult with you as an attorney, right? Should I consult with you when I want to set the LLC up, when I'm in, getting my product and figuring out my business plan? Or should I wait till I get the lease in hand and then reach out to you in a fire sale in an emergency situation? Like, give me a little idea of what would be best practices for a small business owner getting started.
Sure. If we're talking about a business that's brand new and just getting started, I always advise bringing an attorney in early, because there's a whole host of issues that you're not even thinking of when you're thinking about your business. Because when you're in business, you're thinking about making money, getting your business up and running, and trying to be successful at it. Having someone from the beginning is critical, in my opinion. And there's so many different types of businesses. Every one is different. It's not a cookie cutter approach to this. So having someone counsel you along the way is very important. So to answer your question, absolutely from the outset.
And so if somebody's reaching out to you early on, you help them set up their entity and help them choose their entity type, maybe work with their accountant or help them choose an accountant if they don't have one to get set up properly based on the type of business they are.
Right. Absolutely. I mean, all these things go hand in hand. So very often, much of the advice I'm giving, I always would vet with my clients, other related professionals. So I was helping them, their accountant, their insurance agent, to make sure we're all doing this in lockstep. It's important. And it's not even just so much as just getting their company formed, let's say, because we could usually do that pretty quickly.
Right. Once
we decide on a course of action and once you're about to enter into a lease. But why go through the expense of it all until you actually get a spot, you're up and running, and you want to start operating your business? Usually I try to also encourage people to seek legal counsel early, because when they're dealing with spaces, particularly more sophisticated landlords, they'll get this thing called a letter of intent from a landlord, or they'll be asked to provide one. And, sometimes it'll just look like a form. Oh, this is no big deal. I saw it on the internet. I use this, but half the time it's knowing what not to have in there or what's missing. That's more important than what it says. So that's another reason why I would encourage people to seek professional advice early.
So is a letter of intent legally binding?
Generally, it's not. They're just an expression of the intent of the parties and their interests. But, over the years, I have seen some interesting agents put together interesting agreements that say this is not legally binding except for, A, B, and C of this letter or something along those lines. So, you definitely don't just want to sign whatever a realtor's putting in front of you, or the agent or the landlord, even if it's just called a letter of intent.
Right.
You want to have it vetted and reviewed and negotiated before you get into the heavy lifting of the lease.
So getting started early, getting that letter of intent reviewed so you don't pre-agree to something that you don't want to agree to, and then that landlord says, hey, you put this in the letter of intent, now we have an issue, and then you try to renegotiate it out after the fact is a lot harder than negotiating it early.
Oh, absolutely. I can't tell you how often I'll get a deal where a client didn't seek us out or other counsel before entering into an LOI, a letter of intent, and then we're negotiating the lease, and the landlord's proposed lease has all of these terms in it, and my client says, oh my gosh, I didn't realize what this meant. And yeah, it's difficult to reverse engineer them and pull terms out that the landlord will always say, hey, I accepted this offer based upon what you said you would do.
Do you get anybody that signs a lease and then comes to you after the fact?
Sure, all the time, all the time. Most often that's when there's a problem, right? These leases, we have a phrase at my office, it's never a problem until it's a problem. And very often you could sign a lease, even if it's something basic or something ultra sophisticated, without help, and when you start out, but it becomes an issue later on. You don't realize it's a landmine waiting to explode down the line. Right. And I get that call all the time. Hey, my landlord sent me a letter about this. What does this mean? And it's something they never had contemplated, from the outset.
Best practice is always going to be to start early, get your professionals in line from your attorney, your accountant, and your insurance guy, and anybody else, any other professional you may need along the way with getting into a business, so that everybody understands what's going on, what the expectations are. And then, if you have a partner that takes this, relationship to a whole nother level, right? Do you get into buy-sell situations with people going into partnership or going into business together as well?
Sure, all the time. I mean, the first thing we have to do is, decide who we're representing in that transaction, who's coming to us, and then, propose that they have their own attorney. And very often when you have multiple partners in a business, they don't want to hire their own counsel to review things. It's a cost issue, right? When you're just starting out, every dollar counts. But I can't tell you how important it is to do that from the beginning, especially when you go into business with a partner or more than one partner, because it'll be much more expensive to unwind the problem than it will be to do it right from the beginning. And I see that all the time too.
It's the start with the end in mind, I think, is super important. From the partnership agreement, from a lease agreement, is knowing what your exit strategy is and how to get out of it, and having that in writing. And but it's not going to happen to me, scenario. And the same thing with insurance is it's not going to happen to me, so we don't need to buy that. But knowing what the potential risks are associated with getting into any kind of insurance contract are also very important, with respect to that out. How do we get out of it? What happens if a situation arises? How do I know what I'm going to get down the line? And we're dealing a lot with, when people bring us leases, because we do review insurance clauses in lease. We don't give legal advice. We give insurance advice. And we try to do a pretty good job of it, but we always recommend, bringing the attorney in. But when the situation arises and there's no claim paid out, people look at me as if, we're the bad guy.
Sure.
We try to advise appropriately, but we also try not to oversell. There's a fine line. We had a small business, doesn't have current insurance today. We gave them a nice proposal, asked for a small down payment. Said, well, I can't afford to pay that right now. I said, well, you can't afford not to pay that right now, because if something happens in your store tomorrow and you get sued, well, you're going to lose your store and you might lose your house. And that LLC, while it provides you some protection, right? The LLC provides some protection, but if there's negligence involved, can the LLC be breached and get sued personally from if something happens?
Those are all great questions, and the answer is it's possible.
Typical lawyer.
Great lawyer answer, right? But I've seen it happen. So it definitely is possible. And most often when people are moving 100 miles an hour, setting up a new business, like I said, they're focusing on just trying to get their operation underway. And start the cash flows happening, and then you can build from there. But having the pieces all set up properly from the beginning is of critical importance, and it's more expensive in the long run and more damaging in the long run not to do it right than it is in the beginning.
So I'm gonna pull something here, and you've seen this document. There's a couple of pages here. This is an insurance section to a lease that we've reviewed together. It's a client of yours. There's no names on this paper, so even if James zoomed in, we wouldn't see anything. There's a lot of insurance requirements on this page. And I know that when we review this, we have to take some things out from time to time. They use language that says equal to 100% of full value, full insurance value. Who determines that full insurance value is a big question. Yep. In these situations where, hey, landlord says we want 100% value, but it doesn't say value based on what date, because construction costs in 2019 were significantly less than they are in 2021.
Big difference.
Right? Costs of operating a business are higher today than they were in 2019. So business interruption needs to go up as well. And I don't know if rents have come down that much, during the pandemic timeframe. I don't think they have. So there's not really any deals out there. So how do we know if we're doing it right? We do things to the best of our ability, but if the landlord turns around and says, hey, I don't think you have the right insurance, does the landlord or the tenant, who has the upper hand in this with respect to either remediating and fixing the insurance or terminating the lease? Like, how strong is the insurance section in a lease for somebody to, have repercussions or be able to remediate and fix something?
Well, it's very important. I mean, so, some leases, like you said, you get a mom and pop lease. They're usually pretty simple. Got to maintain a certain level of insurance or something along those lines.
And it's been faxed 100 times, so it's just faded beyond belief.
It's faded. It's angled. There's like fax information on the top, like 6 times on the top of the page. But when you get to more professional, institutional landlords, for example, who have sophisticated legal counsel, you're going to get a very sophisticated insurance section of a lease, and we got to look at it very carefully. The proof is in the pudding, right? The language of the lease is paramount. If it addresses the scenario, how do you determine that valuation or what the cost is going to be? Then that's what's going to control. If it doesn't, it's a very good question, and it's something that you can raise when you're evaluating the insurance sections of a lease. What unknowns am I going to have to deal with later? And if a landlord comes back and has an opinion on a certain value that you don't agree with, if there's no mechanism in the lease to resolve that, we get back to a reasonableness type of standard, which can go in many different directions. Is it the actual cost of the construction at the time? Is it the value of that replacement at the time of the actual loss? If a loss occurs, to have to pay it back, pay to rebuild it. Let's say it's a building. All of those are critical importance.
So sometimes, I feel like it puts me in a bad spot sometimes because I'm working for the business owner. If I'm representing the business owner, if I'm representing the landlord, I take a whole different stance on it. I'm like, more right. Insurance. But if I'm representing the business owner, I'm like, that's overkill. You have too much coverage. We still want to maintain high levels of coverage, but we also want to bring it down to a reasonable level. Like, I think a lot of these landlords start high and they'll negotiate down a little bit. It's ask for 10 million, but we know we're going to accept 5 million.
Yeah, most often they expect that.
Instead of ask for 5 and go to 1, right? You can never go up with it later on. You can always negotiate down. So remember that. If you're negotiating, start high and then you can negotiate to an acceptable level. Where I was going with that thought, but it's always, starting high, going low. And then when we're working with a business owner, we want to make sure they have reasonable coverage. When sometimes we think some of this is excessive, and we'll try to make recommendations to bring the lease down to a reasonable level. But, I don't want to get in trouble for advising somebody incorrectly. Is it my responsibility as the business owner's insurance agent to then follow the lease? And can I get in trouble if, can I get dragged into a situation here? I'm like, now I'm getting free legal advice instead of anything else.
It's a tough question to answer because it all
You're
depends
answering one
on,
of these yes, no, maybes again.
Yeah, sort of, maybe, kind of. It's a lot of notice issues, right? So if you're aware of it, make your client aware of it, and then it's on them to decide yes or no, and then you just, prudent business standard type of follow-up, and just to make sure things are okay and they're following it. But, collaborating with the professionals on it are probably the most important thing you can do.
Right.
Hey, these are my thoughts. Talk to your attorney, get his or her input, see what they have to say, and then we'll come up with the best solution for you. And then ultimately, you're just trying to put as much information in front of the client as possible for them to make the most informed decision.
Right.
Right. Sometimes clients make great decisions, sometimes not so great decisions. Our job is to steer them what we feel is in the right direction, give them the information to make the best choice.
At the end of the day, they're writing the check for rent.
That's right.
They're writing the check for the insurance. They're writing the check for the legal fees. So at the end, the business owner is ultimately on the hook for anything that happens, and it's up to us to try to advise and guide people to the best of our ability. If the business owner chooses not to comply, it may not be the insurance section. Can a landlord terminate the lease? It has to go in front of a judge. It has to be vetted in court. How sticky can it be? I'm just trying to make a point of how important this lease agreement is and how binding it is, to be to the letter of what's written in there.
Yeah, I mean, most often they'll have some type of notice provision where or a disclosure provision where you're required to provide your certificates of insurance and so forth to evidence that you're complying with the lease, right? And a landlord can ask for that. Most often they can ask for it at any time or in reasonable times. And if you don't provide it, you're typically going to get a default notice from your landlord saying, hey, you didn't provide this, you don't provide it within X amount of days, this is what we're going to do. And they can give you a list. Typically it's anything from terminating your lease or to imposing compliance by force placing you with insurance. So a landlord can go and engage in self-help in many instances where they can say, hey, you didn't get the insurance you're supposed to get in place. You didn't provide us proof of that. We went and got it. Here's the cost, and they charge it back to you. And then it becomes rent or additional rent, or becomes rent under the terms of the lease. And then if you don't pay that, then that's a default situation potentially. Right. Can get you into further trouble. So you want to keep a close eye on those obligations and make sure you're providing the landlord with what they need to comply with the lease.
Right. Getting into things early is going to be the most important thing. So if, what is your advice to a new business owner? I know we threw a lot of advice out there for somebody starting a new business. What's the one thing that they need to do besides hiring you?
Which is a great idea.
Which is a great idea, getting the professionals behind you. But if there was one piece of free advice that you could give to people that are watching right now before they sign or enter into a lease agreement, what would it be?
They really need to know what their business strategy is in both the short and the long term. You said something earlier about, seeing the end game early, right? Knowing where you're going with this. Right. I mean, very often in business, sometimes you don't know. Business could take lots of twists and turns along the way. Pandemics, for example, is just one extreme example of that. How do you deal with that? What's your plan for that? Most businesses didn't plan for something like this. It's now something I think every business owner is thinking about, But having your plan early and knowing where you want to end up and how to get there is most important in my mind. Knowing when you're able to take care of these obligations, like some business owners look at a critical mass of cash flows and business sales in order to afford all these things that we're suggesting they do from the beginning. Right. At some point you reach that. And I know very often in the beginning it's hard to do when you're first starting out, and I have these discussions all the time with clients. You give them the information, they say, I can't do it yet, I can't afford it yet, I need to get started. But tackling those things as quickly as you can along the way is ultra important.
It's tough. I mean, I've been there. I'm a scrappy business owner, and I still am a little bit scrappy, but I have great resources, and I'm a little bit smarter than I was when I was 25 and getting into business. And then I use the professionals around me. But you brought up a great topic about the current pandemic situation that we're in, and the lack of business interruption insurance around the pandemic. Some landlords are saying, hey, you have to have all risk business interruption. And there's tenants are like, well, my insurance agent said it doesn't exist. And it doesn't for the most part. There are some cases going on where there's some insurance companies have been breached for the business interruption, but not all of them. Mm-hmm. And I do think that the federal government at some point, as soon as they get their heels together, there will be the pandemic risk reinsurance program, which you can then buy into for the next time. But it's not going to be written into any, national insurance program specifically for an insurance company because it's very difficult. But I know that there are landlords trying to put into leases, if there's another pandemic, you're paying your rent, whether you like it or not, right? I know that language is there. It's coming if it's not, already fully out there, right?
We're starting to see it, or some variations of that.
It's
everybody's
scary.
Thinking about it. Yeah,
right.
Everybody's thinking about it now.
It's top of the mind, but the insurance piece of that puzzle is just not there yet to cover it, and it will be. And we see in New York leases the TRIA, Terrorism Risk Insurance Act. That's required to be purchased for anybody leasing a business in New York City, in and around the city area. Sometimes in our area, the bigger landlords want to make sure you have TRIA as well. for property and liability coverages. And so the PRIA, the pandemic risk insurance, is going to be, required in these leases as well. But that's, federally backed, federal insurance-based program, not to be mixed with your A-rated required insurance company for your building coverage. And when we're writing insurance on the coast, well, we're using a lot of Lloyd's of London. We're not using a rated company. We're not using an admitted company. So sometimes we need to make sure we strike that from the lease. So great advice is to just seek your professionals early. Make sure, spend the money, even though you don't have it, just find a way to negotiate a deal with an attorney, an accountant, and get your insurance guy on board to really support you in starting your business.
And really incorporate into the business plan. It's just another cost of doing business. Unfortunately, it is what it is, but the idea is to save yourself much aggravation, money, and the potential catastrophic loss to your business later on.
Right.
That's the idea. You got to protect yourself and protect your investment.
Sounds great. Joe, thank you so much for joining us today. I appreciate you taking the time to sit down and talk about commercial leases. I definitely want to get into some employment-related issues next time. There's so much we can talk about, the legal world with employees and leases and buildings and buying homes is never ending. And as long as I have a camera in your face, I get some free advice. So I'm all about it. So thanks for joining us, Joe.
You got it anytime, Aaron.
Appreciate it.
Thanks.